This is an interview conducted for the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. My name is Emma Cieslik. I use she, her pronouns. We are recording at 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday, March 10th at the Oral History Laboratory on the Ball State University campus. I wanted to sincerely thank you for taking the time and for agreeing to contribute to the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. Starting off, can you please introduce yourself?
I'm go by Kate Esther Johnston, and I'm ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA. I work as a chaplain currently at Ball Memorial Hospital.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. What pronouns do you use?
She, her, and hers.
Would you mind please sharing your age?
Yeah, I'm 34. I had to think about that for a second. 34.
When and where were you born?
I was born in Normal, Illinois, and then moved here not long after. Mm-hmm.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up mainly here in Muncie. I was here in the Yorktown school system from first grade through 12th grade. I finished schooling in the Muncie area before I moved away for college.
That's exciting. When and how did you become aware of LGBTQ issues?
Honestly, I mainly became aware of them outside of this community. When I went away to college, I had kind of my first encounter of recognizing that there was really people who were concerned about these issues. I knew people who were identifying as gay or lesbian or transgender as I was growing up, but didn't really understand that this was an issue or a conversation that people were having. So it wasn't really probably more until I got to graduate school that became a very important issue and conversation for me.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I know you mentioned that it was outside of the Muncie community. Mm-hmm. Would you mind please talking a little bit about your family experiences here in Muncie?
Yeah, so I grew up in, honestly, a family that was never very specifically against people of different sexualities. My father's a professor in music, and so we grew up with students he had or friends or faculty who identified as gay or lesbian. My church also had people who came in and out at times who were gay or lesbian or transgender. I remember one transgender person in my church, and as kids, us kind of having questions about it, but my family normalizing it. So it wasn't something completely strange in my family, but also wasn't something that was brought up as something we should identify as or something that we would possibly be. There was never an option for me that I might prefer girls in my sexual relationships, or there was never really an option for me in my family of origin that I might consider myself not a girl, but a boy. So it wasn't that I wasn't aware of these things, but there also wasn't necessarily a lot of growing up here in Muncie where that was something that was encouraged in our family of origin. Yeah.
Yes. I know you mentioned that there were some leaders and people active in the church who identified in that community. Yeah. Which church did you grow up here in Muncie?
I grew up in First Presbyterian Church in Muncie, and really it was an issue that has really gained kind of perspective as I moved away from this community. But that's been true for the whole denomination of the Presbyterian Church USA as a whole. While I was away, they did have a pastor who identified as a lesbian at one point. There have been leaders on session or elders, that kind of thing as well. So, but again, that has kind of gained some momentum and some awareness as I moved away from Muncie. And then now as I came back, there's a much more, I guess, normalized feel around it, that we're all allowed to kind of be who we are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your childhood here in Muncie?
Yeah. So I grew up, I was the child of a Ball State professor and of a nurse who worked in the school systems. I had two sisters. And again, in my childhood, I grew up in a very educated upbringing, expected that I would go on to college, possibly graduate school. I ended up actually deciding to attend when I kind of ran out of classes at my own high school. I attended the Indiana Academy for Science, Mathematics, and Humanities. And that was really the first time that I really ran into people my own age who were questioning their own sexuality. The school I had gone to here in the Muncie area did not have an openness for that. So that just really, while there are people I know now who identify as gay or lesbian or transgender from my class, that was not a conversation being had at my public school. But when I came to the Indiana Academy, there were definitely people who were already out and living that life. There were people who were questioning their sexuality, exploring their sexuality. To be honest, I really was not sure what to think about it at that age because it had not been something I had encountered at all. But some of my best friends, who I really was very close to there, were either exploring or already identified as gay, lesbian, transgender, some sort of label that they were willing to already identify and claim. And so I was close friends with those people. So that's really where it started to kind of my own journey of questioning, like, is this more fluid? Does this need a label? My own questions started then. And in my upbringing, we're welcomed in my church. Like, I had great Sunday school teachers who welcomed questions and didn't just shut them down. And so in that kind of childhood growth experience, I started out at one point and kind of moved completely to a more wondering, I guess, before I left Muncie. Yeah.
Yes. I'm really curious, what made the Indiana Academy a safer space for LGBTQ students than public schools?
I think part of it was that had already been claimed there, right? So there were students already there. Every year a new class would come in, and there was already a class who lived there on campus. And so they'd kind of welcome this new class. Somewhere along the way, that culture had been identified as okay. I think that helped that we had professors as teachers, so we had more educated people as our teachers rather than people who maybe had a bachelor's degree. These were people who had gone to universities and done graduate studies, and so they had been exposed to something new. They had met people and loved them and recognized, okay, of course we're going to encounter high school students who are encountering this same questioning in their lives and wondering, what their sexuality is as everyone's going through puberty. So I think that was part of it. And then another piece of it was people were coming from all over. So they weren't just from Muncie. Like, I had friends from there who were right outside the Chicago area who lived in Indiana. And so it was just this mesh of city and rural and people coming together that I think allowed for people to question who they were. And truly so many people who were focused on intelligence and growing their own academia, that they just kind of were who they were. Like, there were people who also were studying Elvish from Lord of the Rings, and people were like, that's cool, like, be you. So I think there was just like an openness to getting to like follow your own interests, and that was one of them, right? Whatever your interest might be, whether it was women's studies, gender studies, that kind of thing, like, students then began to take that on themselves. Yeah.
Yes. I'm curious to ask, do you consider yourself an ally?
I do consider myself an ally, yes. I consider myself an ally, definitely. I've also never fully closed off the fact that, like, right now I'm in a heterosexual relationship and I love my spouse, but, like, if my spouse were to pass away, I'm not somebody who thinks that sexuality is totally, like, stagnant. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not someone who would say, oh, I would never identify as blank. I just don't think that's really how sexuality and love works in humans. So I identify as an ally, and I'm always open to the fact that, like, my label I have chosen could possibly change at some point.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what role did the Indiana Academy play in your identity as an ally?
I think it probably honestly had a very pivotal role for me, because at that point in my life, I was in a place where religiously, even though I don't know that I was ever taught this specifically at my church, I was part of other youth groups and people, you just kind of like learn other people's religion. And I was really still in a place where I thought if you were gay, you were somehow sinning. And I had heard that over and over, and it was not taught to me by my parents, and it was not taught to me by my denomination or the church my parents were taking me to. However, I was attending like other youth groups with kids that were cooler or things like that, and it was being taught there. And so it was at the Indiana Academy that I began not only to question sexuality and then become an ally of my friends who were exploring, and I thought were wonderful people, and clearly like this was who they are. But then also, and that made me start to question my faith and my religion, because I didn't want to be a part of something that wasn't loving. And so it was really there in meeting this kind of melting pot of students that were just so different and unique. And then I was kind of like, in a lot of ways, this became maybe a little bit different as this like very close-minded, white educated girl, right, who like had not experienced a lot of life yet. And so it was really kind of in those people who decided to accept me for that and love me in the midst of that and kind of pull me along with their learning that I began to see the world in kind of in a different way, I guess. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Are there any particular relationships that are very significant in your life?
Yeah. When I especially think about kind of my own journey in the world, right now I currently have a spouse who is male and has always been very open, and so he was a key person in kind of like helping me along on the journey as well. I met him in graduate school, and so he's a very key person in my life who has been a part of my learning. And as being married people, we have really committed to challenge one another in our growing and our open-mindedness and our love for others. And so that's a normal part of our relationship. I would say another key relationship for me would be in graduate school. When I very first started graduate school, I had two roommates who were both identifying as female, and in an apartment, and I was attending seminary, so a religious institution, and one of them identified as lesbian, and that just like coming from where I came from like blew my mind. And I was going to like this very progressive seminary, so it shouldn't have, but again, like no awareness on my part. And so it's really interesting though, that first relationship was really not a good one. Like we're friends now, but she just didn't really know what to do with the fact that like I had come from this just like very conservative environment, and she did not grow up like that at all. But I met another woman who identifies as woman, and she identifies as lesbian as well, and we ended up being roommates the rest of seminary. And she's one of my best friends. Like my daughters call her and her spouse aunts. And that relationship for me was like so pivotal. Like she was willing to see where I was in my growth process and like love me as I was, which she did not have to do, right? I'm sure the amount of people that she's had to do that for is completely unfair. And so I'm very aware of that she did that anyways. And that she welcomed me into her life. And then as she met her now spouse lived with us before they were married as well. So I like got to know them as they were like dating and like getting engaged. And that relationship for me has been so pivotal in my own life. As I think about these issues always, I think where her name is Katie, like where would Katie be allowed? Like I remember thinking when my child was ready to be baptized, she would be someone that I would want to baptize my child. And my husband was working in this very rural conservative church at the time. And I like began to think like I'm worried about maybe inviting Katie to do that. And I was just like, no, like if this is who I want to baptize my child, like this is who I want to baptize my child. And it ended up they weren't free. And so that was, but she's been a very, very pivotal person in my life. So I would say my spouse in the midst of all of this, and then my roommate, Katie, and now her spouse, Cindy, I'm very good friends with as well. Yeah.
Were there any individuals in the Muncie community growing up that were openly LGBTQ identifying?
Other than the Indiana Academy, which I feel like were people who were not necessarily from Muncie, right? They were people who were either brought in as professors. Sometimes they were here, but I wouldn't call them Muncie people. I know for a fact that my pastor growing up, like I know him well now, is he's retired now, but that he was completely supportive of people in LGBTQ relationships, but he never firmly preached that, from the pulpit. And so I don't know that I knew that growing up. So while I think in some ways like that was a pivotal person for me, because there was clearly an openness in our congregation, but it wasn't in as pivotal of a way that like now like when I'm in a pulpit, I just preach that, right? Like I clearly preach with labels using that like LGBTQ people are loved by God, right? Like I make sure to name that because we need to hear that. And I think that's also part of our learning that we've learned, like, right, we've just kind of like whitewashed it all instead of really claiming that like, yes, like Black lives matter here, LGBTQ lives matter here, like we want them here and God wants them here. So I would say he was pivotal in some ways because, right, he had an openness in Muncie that I didn't find. Other places, like other churches, were not preaching that at all. Didn't have an openness at all. So I would say him. And then honestly, which is weird, my parents in some way were very pivotal. My dad was never really sure, like, he was friends with people who were gay, but he also grew up in a time that wasn't really accepted. And he now is completely like, right, like supportive, and I would say an ally. But that was really through my own education and my conversations with him that his mind began to change on that. But my parents were never completely closed off to it either. And so being in a family whose minds are not 100% set in something, I would say was pivotal. You know, that like, I know that my parents are open to learning something new if they meet the right people or they have relationships with someone that makes them question what they've previously thought. They will critically think about it and choose a different way. So I would say that was pivotal too, just knowing that I had parents who were willing to do that. And it took me a while as I was becoming an adult to recognize they were willing to do that because I had only known them as like authoritarians before, right? So I would say mainly those were the pivotal people in my life here in Muncie, because truly I did not have much of an openness until I went to the Indiana Academy. Yeah.
Yes. What was the name of the pastor?
Ron Naylor, Reverend Ron Naylor. So I was trying to think of titles. I think he's Reverend Dr. Ron Naylor. So
thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I like to choose people's titles when I know them, so I was trying to think of it.
I know that you mentioned that religion was important to you growing up. Mm-hmm. How did religion affect your ideas about sexuality growing up?
Yeah, so honestly, that was like the main piece for me. Religion has been important to me at a young age, and it wasn't necessarily. So going to church every Sunday was important to my family, and my family was more than just people who went to church on Sunday. We participated and served, and like that was part of our active life. But I would say for me, it took on a different part of my life, a more invested wholeness part of my life than my sisters or even my parents. Like at time, my parents were like, "She's really into this. Like, is this weird?" Like, I mean, not like, but like they're a little bit like, "What's going on over there?" And they were supportive of it, which I love, but there was definitely like exploration for me in the midst of that. And so I feel like at different times it took on different ways that it informed this topic. I remember at times as I was exposed to like even different religious ideas or different religions that I hadn't heard of before, like when I was at the academy and I took some like world religions things, I was like, for a while was like, oh, how does like Buddhism fit into this? Or how does Taoism fit into this? But mainly my upbringing was informed by a very Christian white narrative. Because that was honestly what was present in the part of Muncie I was living in, was this like educated white Christian community that was kind of an offshoot of Ball State University. I mean, my church is right on Ball State University's campus. It was just like a lot of professors went there. So again, that's where like I think the openness entered in because it was educated people, but also like my narrative was mainly formed by a religion that told me there is a right and good way of living. I just want to be clear that that's not necessarily how I think of religion now, but this was how I thought of it then. A right and good way of living, and that there was a wrong way of living, right? Like it was more of some sort of like rule book, I guess. And that was probably a key part of my faith and spirituality, and then how all of my ideas were filtered through, probably until honestly, like really the end of college. There was always some openness there as I was questioning and wondering, but that was still a main part of my framework until that framework kind of got dismantled in seminary and I chose a new way to filter things. But so, yeah, I would say it was the main piece of how I learned about all topics, including this one. Yeah.
Yes. I'm curious, I know you mentioned being part of some youth groups and that there were some churches that weren't as supportive.
Yeah.
Which were the churches in particular here in Muncie?
So it's really interesting because one of them is affiliated with the United Methodist Church, and it was this big youth group called the Harbor. There were other big youth groups here that I went to like once and was totally weirded out by. Like one called 180 that was from Center Chapel, although both of those are from United Methodist churches, which generally United Methodist churches can really go either way, right? And so now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, but these both were, and they were, the key piece that for me has stuck with me and is important is that these youth groups were led by people who are not necessarily seminary educated, which has then become very important to me in my own life, that we will not give kids and youth, the uneducated people, to just teach them whatever they want about their faith. The most educated people should be teaching our young children and our youth. So that has informed me since I learned this the hard way growing up. And they were people that maybe were attending Taylor or attending, right? It's not that they were uneducated people, but they also had their own viewpoints that were not necessarily that of the denomination, but they were growing youth groups because they were saying things that were cool, or they were somehow, whatever. The music was interesting. I don't know. And so I went to the Harbor for a long time and was very invested in that youth group outside of my own church, which my parents continued to allow me to do, but and this is where I thank them, they were like, you can go to that youth group, that's fine, but you're going to the one at our church as well, and you will be invested in our denomination until you're out of our house. And so I still at least had that grounding point in our own denomination that was a little bit more open, and with youth leaders that my parents knew. But yes, the Harbor was probably the main one. I went to other ones with my friends. Yeah, I mean, I remember going to a youth group thing with one of my friends where they were baptizing kids without parental consent. I mean, I didn't get baptized because I was like, this is weird. But also preaching this message that yes, you should not be gay, you shouldn't, right? And I remember I was stuck there because it was a lock-in. And yes, and so, I mean, I can laugh about it now, but it was truly I remember being I guess, I don't know, creeped out, but it felt creepy. It felt creepy to me. One of my friends who was there with me, we were both invited. We still are that was the weirdest thing ever. But that was here in Muncie, right? There were these odd kind of spiritual youth gatherings that were normal, that lots of kids were going to, that even then I was this does not feel right or consensual or loving. But right, I was still a part of them in some way because my friends were there, or I didn't ever say this is gatekeeping or keeping people. I think I knew it because I knew that there was something not right about it, but I also didn't say anything. So yeah, there were several like that, but the two that specifically come to mind were 180 and the Harbor. Yeah.
Yes. I know you mentioned also that you moved into seminary. Would you mind talking a little bit about your educational background?
Yeah. After I graduated from high school, I went to college at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, which is associated with the Reformed Church of America, although not really associated with that anymore, but is a very Christian identifying campus. And I would say I don't super love the label conservative, but that's what it was. And so I got my education there for my bachelor's degree. I was in social work. And so I ended up meeting kind of this more open-minded group of people in social work because, right, I don't know how you're a social worker if you're not open-minded because you're meeting all different kinds of people every day and trying to help them. And so that kind of then guided me into my graduate studies. I ended up choosing McCormick Theological Seminary. which was a hard decision because I also had been offered like a full ride at Princeton Seminary. And but when I went to visit Princeton, it was much more in the same vein of like a much more white culture and educated culture, similar to what I had already known. And so I ended up choosing McCormick, which very much like brands itself. I think its little tagline is like ecumenical, diverse, urban, and so it was inner city Chicago on the south side. And so I ended up getting my graduate studies done there and did 3 full years to get my seminary education completed.
That's very exciting. I know that from your seminary education, you had moved back to Muncie. Was there any place that you lived in between there?
Yeah, I lived in, this is going to sound like a lot. I came back to Indianapolis after, just briefly to complete my chaplain residency. And then I moved to Pennsylvania with my spouse. He took his first church call. We had in our marriage that we would take every other call. So he had come with me to complete my residency in Indianapolis. We went to Pennsylvania for him to take his first church call. We went to Michigan for me to take my first church call. And then we went to Minnesota for him to take his next church call. And then we've ended up back here, which is where we plan to stay now. Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Mm-hmm. I was curious, I know you've mentioned throughout the interview the term conservative. Can you say a little bit more about why you don't love that label?
I think like a lot of labels, it can clump things together that I'm not sure whether or not they should be clumped together. Like I think of politics, you use the word conservative, and religion, you use the word conservative. And so I think in religion, it can be a little confusing to me because I don't think that word should be tied with politics in any way, shape, or form. It has kind of its own meaning within the church, which is why I don't love using it in the church. But I think in mainstream language, that's kind of like what we know as a word that everyone knows within the church. Generally, I would use in the church more fundamental or traditional, but I think sometimes outside of church circles, those words get lost as well. So that's why I've kind of named that. It's like, it's there, and I'm always aware, like, how do you talk church speak in a world that maybe doesn't always know church speak?
Yes. How does that label, how did it apply to Muncie during your childhood versus what you see today?
It's interesting. I think church-wise and political-wise, I would still mainly label both as conservative, fundamental. I would say most of the people that I meet in my job, in the hospital, I'm mainly serving people who have a fundamental idea, a conservative view of Christianity. Just plainly, those are mainly the people I'm serving. I meet other people, but I would say the majority of the people that I meet, that is the lens that they are still viewing spirituality, religion through. Not only is that the lens they're viewing their own spirituality through, but they're not able to see another lens to view it through. And so that's where that word conservative comes in for me, and is still one I would probably use in the midst of this town. I've seen some growth, right? Like I've met other people in other areas in the midst of coming back with some changed views. Have those always been here? Maybe, and I didn't know, right? Like it's truly possible. And again, I know this town has grown a lot too since I've been here, so I can't say for certain on that, but I would still say majority-wise, when I go into a room at the hospital, I kind of have an expectation of where someone's religious perspective might be, and I'm always kind of like surprised if it ends up being something different. So,
yes,
delightfully surprised, but yes, but surprised nonetheless.
I know you engage with a lot of hospital staff members. Mm-hmm. Would you say that the belief systems and the care surrounding it also fit under that label?
I would say that that's true probably for the RNs, because a lot of the nurses have lived in this area, grew up in this area or surrounding areas. So I find that when I'm, kind of have my chaplain hat on with the staff, that I kind of expect that many of the nurses will that will be their own faith background. However, they are always like very professional people who they can be guarded around even letting a chaplain into the room, thinking that's what I will do. They don't want me to like proselytize to their patients, right? Which is not my job and is actually against what my job is. But so there's always this like educating piece of like, even if that's their faith background, they have that extra layer of like, but we realize that's not like professional, what we should be doing here. But when I am engaging them in their own life, I have nurses often who, you know, even in their own practice, they see all the time, science. They'll ask me still to pray that their grandbaby, who is supposed to be born with a very severe, you know, disability, that I would pray that there would be a miracle and everything will be fine. And, you know, that's always hard because they see, it's like, I can't change what already is. God can't change what already is. And so I would say that piece is still among the staff. The physicians, most of them come in from someplace else. And so again, it's kind of like a melting pot. We have people who I randomly run into in the hospital always when the switchover happens for residents, you know, in the middle of the summer, who suddenly are asking for where the chapel is right at the time that they should be praying toward Mecca. And I know, like, okay, here's our new group of like residents who are Muslim and will be in the chapel praying whenever they can at that time of day. They want to know where it is and they want to establish that. So I would say there is a mix among the staff, but it probably depends again on like what level of education that staff person has. Yeah.
Yes. And then that's a great transition into my questions about your work. What resources are available for LGBTQ individuals at Wall Memorial?
I know at least a big thing that happened recently was they made sure all of the bathrooms on every floor, there are at least unisex bathrooms on every floor, so that everyone can feel comfortable choosing a bathroom that feels appropriate for them. And so I have not had a problem, like when I've noticed that actually our hospital here at IU Health Ball is better than even some of the other IU Health hospitals. They made that change specifically because of an issue that happened with someone who came into the ER and didn't receive the care that they needed or wanted. I don't know the full story, but I know that's the story behind it. And so the hospital really made a push at that point to really kind of up, like, we need to serve our whole community and make sure people feel comfortable here. So I know that bathroom change happened. Also, when you walk in the doors, you will immediately see little stickers and signs on all the windows that says, like, this is an LGBTQ friendly health space. Like, during Pride Week last year, a lot of the staff had like a little bit of a rainbow trim on their badge to let people know they were safe people. And so there's been kind of like a more of a push, I would say, to make sure that people know there are friendly spaces they can talk to. So those services are definitely like trying to be pushed. There's also a staff group through the whole IU health system that is specifically for LGBTQ people and allies to kind of like continue to push healthcare. So that's just for staff, but it helps all the staff people then think through how could we serve better as a hospital? Like, what are we missing? What are we not seeing? Because maybe somebody in environmental services who's cleaning the rooms notices something that a doctor wouldn't notice, right? And so how do we as a staff kind of come around those issues? So there has been some push in that and some creation of that and some support of that. Like, I heard that my first day of orientation that this group existed. And there are other groups like that for other issues, right? So that's there. And then I think in that, it's just a continued learning to speak up as staff. And I've had to push myself on this. If I see that someone is kind of like, we have, you know, a lot of the times I would say it's lesbian moms. I don't usually see gay dads who are coming through because who I'm usually seeing is labor and delivery. So it's a woman who's delivering. But we have that often, and it's just kind of like, even with some of our staff who may, you know, like to normalize, like, yep, these are just two parents. So like, let's figure it out, right? Like, we don't need to like whisper about this or make some big deal about it. We just need to like love these two parents and serve them well, right? Serve their health needs well and serve them as humans well. And so I find that there's just some reminding at times about that as people maybe experience it for the first time, or people haven't encountered that before. But it's becoming much more normal, even at IU Health Ball Memorial Hospital, that we have families that look different than the traditional male, female, 2-point whatever kids. So.
Yes. You mentioned that you work in the NICU and the labor delivery department. Is that where most of your work happens?
Yes and no. I have mainly made NICU and actually usually mother baby, not labor and delivery. So once they've delivered, usually mother baby and NICU, kind of my main priority area for breaking into, because one, that's where my experience lies. Two, that's where my own personal journey lies as somebody who struggled with infertility and pregnancy loss. And three, we just didn't have a chaplain who was really like, and had that training and invested in women's health care in that way. And so I've spent a lot of my time trying to build relationships in that area, recognizing that the spiritual whole and body is so important in birth and delivery and healing for a whole family, whatever that family looks like. And so I would say that that's been my main area that I always keep. And then I serve other areas of the hospital as well. So, and that's kind of, it shifts as different chaplains come in or supervisors come in. But the NICU and mother baby have been my main areas I have an interest in. Yeah.
Yes. Did you have anything else you'd like to say?
Oh, no.
And then because I know you say that spiritual health is so important for the whole health. Mm-hmm. How do you help the spiritual health of LGBTQ patients at Ball Memorial?
Yeah. So everyone, I think, has unique spiritual health. And so for me, there are some mainstays for every single person that I think is important. I think being known is really important for your spiritual health. And so I make sure to learn everyone's names in the family and call people by their names that they've chosen. And I do that for everyone. While a lot of people in the hospital, and I don't think this is bad care for doctors or anything, but they'll often call mom, mom, and dad, dad, instead of, Mary and Lisa, I don't know, whatever. And so for me, that's a really key piece of spirituality, is helping people be known and using their names, their pronouns as they would like to be used. And so I'm very attentive to listening to that and making sure people feel known in that way. And that crosses over then really well into the LGBTQ community of making sure, I want to use your proper name. I want to use your proper pronouns that you feel are comfortable. And I want to completely normalize and celebrate with you that this is a dream for your family, right? And so that's a part of our spiritual health, that people have fears about these babies, people dream about these babies, people maybe thought I would never have this baby, but I somehow got this baby, especially in the LGBTQ community. I know similar in my own life, it's like having a baby by birth is not a given. Right? You have to do something. You have to go to a doctor. And I had to do that in my own life, and it's scary and it's terrifying and it's expensive and it's a long journey, and you just pray that somehow you'll end up with a breathing baby at the end, and you don't know. It's not a given like it is for other people. And so I feel like in lots of ways I've been able to identify with that, recognizing it wasn't a given for me. And that's really scary, and that's where our spirituality comes in the midst of that health journey. It's like when it's not a given for you that you'll get a baby and the rest of society feels like it's a given, you feel like you're hitting some pretty big mountains.
Yes.
So I kind of try to be in the midst of that care and empathize with it and allow them to share their own stories in the midst of that so that they feel heard, and so that they don't leave some trauma behind from their birth story, from their birth journey. They're able to move forward with this new child. So.
Yes. I'm curious, from your own experiences working in the pregnancy aspect of it, are there any particular experiences with lesbian parents that stand out to you?
I've had several, but one that especially stuck out to me were these two moms, and it's really interesting. I mainly only met the mom who didn't give birth because the mom who gave birth was sick the whole time. And when they're sick after birth, they often get put on magnesium. I don't know really what that means other than it makes them very tired and they have to stay on the labor and delivery floor. So she was over there basically still asleep. And this other new mom, so the other partner, is taking care of twins by herself. And like one ended up in the NICU and then one got to go out of the NICU but couldn't come back. So she's trying to juggle these like two babies on her own. And her wife is like right over. And so it was just to me like this like, oh my gosh, they've had this traumatic journey, right, to like get these babies here. And now they're like in the midst of this traumatic healing journey for one of the partners. And so they really stuck out to me because this mom who was kind of juggling the two babies and was healthy was just like, there's nothing I can do for like my wife right now. I don't know what I can do. What I can do is take care of these babies. And I feel bad that she's missing this because she worked so hard to get them here. And they just really stuck out to me because I could tell they were just a great partnership who had in mind like, okay, this is what we've been given right now, and they were able to do it, right? They figured out how to just be this really great partnership. And so serving them was like really a privilege, and getting to like hear their story and walk alongside what was, felt like it was turning into a nightmare. And yet both of their babies ended up getting home healthy. Both moms were home healthy at the end. But that really stuck out to me as one of the relationships in the NICU that I was like, yeah, this is why we need to be competent and do what we do, because these parents needed support. They needed a lot of support, and we needed to kind of rally around them to help them get home. Yeah.
Yes. Are there any experiences about staff or other chaplains working with LGBTQ parents that stick out to you?
Yeah, I would say definitely at times like, there has been, I think at times I've heard whispers among staff of kind of being like, well, there's two moms with that one. Like, what do we do? And then there's also another part of the staff that for that is like the social worker, like, right, that's like normal for, right? And so there's always kind of this like, which is why I think teamwork in healthcare is so important, that there's part of the team that's just like, this is completely comfortable for us, and like everyone else needs to get on board of this being completely comfortable as well, right? But I think we push each other in that. And so I continue to remain hopeful that with those voices on a team, that's how things get better, right? Like that's how we serve people better. And I think that has been true, like even in rounds or at times if somebody's like, oh, there's like two moms, like what do we do? What do we say? When somebody who's comfortable with it offers up like, okay, this is what we do. It's like mom and mom, right? Like, or we ask them, are you going by mom or mommy, or like, what do you want to be? Because again, we don't always use names in the NICU. So, okay, well, they've probably considered that too. What would they like their child to call them? We all consider that. Every person considers that, right? Dads consider that. We all want our kid to call us a name we feel comfortable with. And so I think it's just normalizing that and helping people, like when they see people who are comfortable with it, it helps them be comfortable with it. Like, oh, this isn't hard. In rounds, I'll just ask, like, are you going by mom or mommy or mama? Like, what's your chosen name that you want to go by? And then we just call you that the rest of the time, So, yeah, so like I've run into some of that, and I've recognized that like as people just have a comfort with it, it helps other people be like, oh yeah, that's easier than we thought, right? Like this really isn't that much different. But at first it maybe feels different to the staff. So I would definitely say I've seen that. There was another part you asked about that too, I think. Staff and, did you say someone else?
Staff and chaplains as well.
Oh, chaplains. So it's interesting because my job is almost always very solo work, right? Like I don't have another chaplain who's with me because I am the chaplain. Although there are other chaplains, but they're not necessarily in the same situations I'm in. I would say on my staff, though, that the chaplains know that I am the person who is most comfortable and open with sex, sexuality, gender issues, that kind of thing. And that's where my education's been. And some of the other chaplains on staff, maybe that isn't their area, like that's not the denomination they're from or the education that they had. I will, though, say like my supervisor who just left recognized that while that wasn't maybe part of his upbringing or understanding, he was trying to like take every webinar that he could on the topic to try to educate himself. So again, I don't know how comfortable that was for him, but I know that he was, right? Like he was invested in trying. And so I think sometimes as a team, it works out though, because I will say there are people who like very much are into miracle theology and they just really want me to pray for a miracle. And I'll be honest, it's really hard for me. Like that's not really a part of my own theology. And I meet people where they are, so I will do it and pray for it if I need to. But sometimes I will just ask another chaplain to follow that person because it feels more natural. And so in turn, often like I will follow maybe some of these cases because it feels more natural. I'm able to be more natural in the midst of them and being like, I'm really actually interested in following this person. Whereas another chaplain may actually be really interested in following these people interested in a miracle. So I think I've seen it both ways. And I will say, definitely, I would say on staff, and they would all say this, that I'm probably the most comfortable right now with the LGBTQ community. Yeah.
How did your graduate school experience, and I know possibly your dissertation or thesis, how did that help you to be a better LGBTQ health caregiver?
Yeah, it really did. So I went to a seminary that I shared was very open, inclusive, pushing kind of all of us. And so finally my senior year, I was able to take my last like semester pass-fail because I hadn't taken any classes pass-fail. So I decided to kind of give myself a break and I took my classes pass-fail. So then I took some like classes outside of my realm that I felt like I maybe really wouldn't know anything about. So I pushed myself to take queer theory and theology. My roommate was taking it, although we didn't take it at the same class hour. So we were in different sections of it. But my roommate, who I really liked, was taking it and she promised she'd like help me with it. But it was this graduate, like lots of PhD students in it, but master's level students were allowed to take it too. So I took this class called Queer Theory and Theology and did not understand half the books of what I read in that class. Like I literally had to like sit down with my roommate and have her explain them to me because they were so far ahead of what I had been reading, right? So we're like reading Foucault and like people that I was just like, I should have known, right? I guess I don't know, but I didn't know. And like learning about people who have spent their lives really creating a theology around queerness, and it's there, and it's beautiful. And honestly, a lot of it, like I was able to like identify with, and I had no reference for that theological framework at all. So that class, among others, like just being offered these classes that otherwise I never ever would have taken. Was for me like a huge step. And so in that class, she had the PhD students all had to like write, like do more of like start a dissertation, thesis, that kind of thing through that class because that's kind of the track they were on. Well, so there were only a few of us in that class who were master's level students. So she had us kind of choose like a master's thesis to just do in this class. But she wanted it to be applicable. She was like, I want it to be useful. Like if it's not useful for you master's level students who are going on to like be reverends or whatever you're doing, then I'm not really doing my job. So I decided I was really interested in chaplaincy at that point. I had only done my first unit of chaplaincy education, but I decided to do my project on how we should spiritually care for parents of intersex babies so that they were able to have the full celebratory experience of having a child and feel heard and not feel like they had had some sort of accident in the process, which was mainly what I had seen and known from mother baby NICU. But everything is, it's a boy, it's a girl, everything is blue, or immediately you get a bow hat or a non-bowed hat. So like what happens, people don't, all of a sudden they don't know what to do if a baby is born and they can't immediately put it in one category or the other. And so I was very aware, like, and intersex babies are not that rare. And so for me, it was like, okay, so what is this about? Like, what are we doing? And so she just basically let me run with like reading whatever right books. Like, I mean, she helped me find some great books and like reading stories and personal accounts of people who grew up as intersex and like how it changed if they were forced into immediate surgery or how like healthy their lives were if they got to like wait to have the surgery that they chose or wanted. And so she really allowed me in that class to do not only like this very academic thing of like, right, like learning all the statistics and all of this stuff, but also this very personal like thesis of just like really diving into people's stories and getting to read them and reading about people whose intersex bodies had been changed without their consent and what they had lost in that and what pieces of themselves they had lost in that. And their parents' stories who felt terrible because they were following medical guidance and had no idea what they were maybe changing or altering for their child. They just had no idea, right? They weren't, they were in a moment of anxiousness because this is not normalized in our society. And so I ended up doing my thesis on that, and haven't run into it much in Muncie, although I will say the other day there was a baby that we were all wondering, again, because this is with intersex, you just don't know, like when they're born preterm. And so there was a lot of testing done to kind of see, is this a baby with a micro penis? Is this a baby who has maybe an X chromosome that's somewhere? Is there any evidence of, you know, any sort of ovaries, anything like that, right? Because you don't know until you do more testing to kind of see like, oh, like maybe we're gendering this child too early. So we had a recent one in the NICU like that. This baby got sent home, and the parents decided to call the baby a he, and I think that is what it will be. We didn't ever find any evidence of anything else, but again, I think sometimes science is behind in the midst of that, and so we don't fully know, right? And so the staff was really pretty good about it. I mean, I shared in that moment, like this was very recent, but I think the doctors were really surprised to hear that like I did a thesis on that. They were like, what? And I was like, I don't know. It was like, that's what I did my thesis on, right? Like it's really interesting to me and I think it's important. So yeah, I think like my seminary provided me these opportunities to explore something completely new. That I do think has a great impact on our healthcare world. So, yeah.
As a chaplain here at Ball Memorial, how do you care for parents that have intersex children?
So again, like it really hasn't happened here much. I have had it happen when I was at St. Vincent training downtown. And so my piece that I have in the midst of it, what I would do if I was here is I have kind of a spiritual plan in place that I truly think the entire floor needs to switch over to, not just for intersex parents, but I think we need to switch all of our sign. This would take forever at IU Health Ball Memorial. But I still think it's a good idea. Maybe when I'm here for 30 years, I'll make it happen. But I truly think that we need to have signage that celebrates all babies, that is not gender related, especially as more parents, that is not important to them. Like that was not important to me. I didn't have like some huge gender reveal party. People in Muncie, I would say that's still an important part of their culture, but I do think times are changing, and so I wonder what that will look like in 15 to 20 years. That how can we change that ethic around like these colors are boys, these colors are girl colors. Like how can we celebrate in a way that we are just truly welcoming new beloved life, right? And that's all we need to celebrate, because as a healthcare medical staff, I mean, that's all I truly care about, right? Is that somehow we're able to like get this baby home with you in its uniqueness. And so I have a plan that's like written out in place that maybe over many years I will get put into place around changing colors and changing signage and changing our little cards that say it's a boy, it's a girl, right? Like, but I think in the midst of that, for me, when I've run into parents now and that hasn't happened, right? Like that signage hasn't happened. My main thing, spirituality, is encouraging parents to be calm and recognize that they do not have to make any immediate decisions, just like no one does. If your baby is not currently dying, you don't have to make any immediate decisions. And I think for some reason the medical world is all about making quick decisions because like surgeries get scheduled and things happen fast. But the spiritual world is not about that, right? Like we're able to remain calm, we're able to like breathe deeply, and that's how we tend our spirit. And so as parents, like how can you tend your own spirit to recognize you had a lot of sacred, meaningful moments planned? I maybe don't use those words if they're not religious, but right, people have meaningful holy moments planned with their child at first. They want to like spend time cuddling with their child. They want to spend time giving their child their first bath. They want to spend time like trying to breastfeed or feed or whatever, right? Like we all have these, reading their child a book. So do all of those things, right? Like you don't have to do anything else right now as long as your baby is breathing, right? And so that's been my main piece with parents who have any sort of like unexpected news, but when I've had parents who have intersex babies, to remember to not lose sight of what's meaningful and holy in these moments, because those are moments we don't get back. We don't get back our first 3 days with our baby. So how do you start your baby's life in this very like loving environment that you control, not the medical staff controls, but you control those moments. Yeah.
Yes. Have you experienced any other significant moments with LGBTQ parents?
The only other like really kind of, I would say, specific one, so I guess I have two. One would be, we have had some surrogacy on the floor where, and the hospital does great with surrogacy and adoption. So whether that's LGBTQ or not, they've been like really great about planning out that birth mom is in one room and that adoptive parents, whoever they are, get their own separate room but near each other so that they can create these spaces but also this togetherness. And so I have truly appreciated that whoever laid the groundwork for that. That's not true in every hospital, and here at IU Health Ball Memorial, that's the standard of care for any adoptive or surrogate parents. And so to just recognize that that's available and there, that like, yes, these adoptive parents need a room and space to have these moments because the baby needs a healthy place to be checked out and grow, and that will be with their new adoptive parents. But then also a place for this surrogate mom to heal who has gifted a huge gift, right? I mean, I can't truly imagine. And so having time and space for her to heal in her own quiet space is also very important. So they're not just like all on top of each other. So I've seen that done well and been in the midst of that and really can appreciate that about the hospital. One that I just heard the other day, which was really interesting, a volunteer came up to me and said that, and this is the piece about a small kind of, we still operate as a small town hospital, but IU Health is not small. Okay, it's like the second largest ED in the IU Health system, but we still operate as if we're this small town hospital. And so a doctor at one point pulled this volunteer, she's one of the NICU snugglers, we call them. She like snuggles the babies if they're crying, into a room to pray with a patient when she used to, like, he knew that she would pray, and this patient like wanted prayer or had a spiritual need, and this doctor felt like that was out of his realm, and so called this volunteer in, and she said that the patient disclosed to her that he was having this spiritual battle because he felt like he should be a female, and like, right, disclosed this to this patient. She's this elderly woman, she's like, right, and so I'm just sitting there thinking, why is she telling me this story? Like, obviously she's looking for some sort of confirmation or feedback, like what she did. And so I'm just waiting to hear, like, what did she say, what did she do, right? Like, I'm like trying to like listen and be in the midst of it. But she said to me, she said, at first, like, I was so surprised at what he had told me, and then I said a prayer for him before his surgery, because it wasn't like a body change, it was something completely unrelated, but he just disclosed this right before the surgery, I think, because it was on his mind. He'd maybe been told this was a sin. I don't know if he ever followed through on changing, so I don't want to change pronouns because I don't know what happened there. But she said that she prayed for this person that he would know that he was loved no matter what. And I was like, oh, thank God, right? But like, it's not like, literally I breathed a sigh of relief, because I don't know that that's always what, I know that that's not always what happens in these situations. And I've heard, unfortunately, like some harmful stories of people who have been prayed over that this would not be their life, that this would not, and so it gave me, I will say, this small piece of hope that this older woman in Muncie was able to kind of get over her own, like, I did not know what to do with that information, and just pray that this person would remember that God loves them before their surgery. So I will say that was like this little moment of hope for me in like the past 2 weeks, that I was like, okay, right? Like, it's there somewhere. We're maybe moving towards something. And she's someone who's lived in Muncie her whole life. And she's part of, I know, she's part of High Street United Methodist Church right now that has a pastor at it who is an open ally. And so, like, I wonder, like, right at what point has she heard that from her pastor, Stacy, and she remembered that in that moment, you know? So, yeah, I think those moments, they come up on us in very surprising ways. You don't know you're coming into them. It's not like I ever get a consult order that's like, this person's having a spiritual quandary about their sexuality, but it comes up in the midst of my conversations with patients. Or I walk into a room and there's two moms there and I greet them, right? Like, so I would say it's probably maybe a bi-weekly part of my care is that I run into somebody who discloses to me that they either identify as LGBTQ, something of that sort, but I wouldn't say it's also the majority of people at IU Health Ball Memorial Hospital. Yeah.
Yes. I know you mentioned that some people in the LGBTQ community have faced faith environments where their sexuality was viewed as a sin. Mm-hmm. How do you approach those situations and care for them spiritually?
So as a chaplain, my job is always, first and foremost, to be a listener. So I try to draw out people's stories because I recognize in the midst of those stories, there's trauma and hurt, and someone needs to hear them. I am not always someone as a chaplain who gives someone advice or tells someone what I believe, but in those moments I do. Those are moments where I have decided it's worth me saying, I want you to hear from me as someone who is ordained that I think you're beloved by God and that God created you this way and that there's a reason you're here and who you are. And I don't often do that with patients, but in these situations I do because I think it's few and far between that the LGBTQ community has heard from someone who's ordained that they are wanted, that they are needed, and that they are a valuable part of the community. And I truly believe that. My theology informs me that God wanted diversity. And so whenever we gatekeep that out, we're doing it wrong. And so whenever I provide spiritual care in the hospital, for me, if someone discloses a way in which they've been hurt by the church in any way, but especially when it comes to issues around sexuality, that is a time when I usually speak up. I make sure first to hear their story because I think that's important that they feel heard. But then I make sure to offer that there's someone who thinks different. I see in that moment that, like, I always hope at some point they will hear God calling them in a loving way and be able to recognize those other voices as voices that were wrong. And I have no problem, like, saying those voices are wrong. And so I'm always hopeful that they'll hear something new, and they'll experience love and hope in a new way and see themselves in a new beloved way. Because I think that's so hard to do in our society. And so much of my spiritual care really is focused on how do I help this person see themselves as more than enough in God's eyes. And so, yeah, those are moments when I do often offer out a message rather than just kind of being, often I see myself as just being someone who comes along to meet someone where they are in their moment in the hospital and support them wherever they are, because it's not a time when you're in the midst of, like, tragedy to try to move someone. That's not my place. But I do see in those moments that as an opportunity to say, I see you as loved, and if you never set foot in a church again, that's okay. Like, that's 100% okay, right? And I would not judge anyone for that. Just so, right, to kind of be able to be a voice of, like, yes, this has been incredibly hurtful and terrible, and I see you as, like, beloved and valuable. So
it's wonderful. And I'm curious, I know you mentioned that there were some experiences that happened with volunteers, and are there any other experiences where chaplains say the same things? Are they communicating with patients in the same way?
I know a lot of chaplains who are. I don't know if the chaplains in my office, being really honest, like, I've been in this office in Muncie for a year. I don't honestly know whether they are allies or support. I do know that they are board certified, and so therefore will meet someone and will not judge them. But I'm not sure what their own personal viewpoints are on it, because I just would say, like, it's clear that we're very different people, but we get along as chaplains well enough to work together, if that makes sense. And so I'm not entirely sure what they would say in that moment. And I think that's always this like really hard part for me of being a chaplain. When I switched from just being specifically in my denomination, you know, I work with chaplains from time to time who don't think women should be pastors. And so I've kind of learned that it's like what I can focus on is my work as chaplain, what I feel called to do, because otherwise I sometimes feel like my like head will explode, because literally I work with people who don't think I'm called to do what I'm doing because I have a uterus, right? So it's like, I don't know like what that even means, right? But like it can be hard in religion, being anyone who has ever deemed as part of the outside group. And so I've learned in some ways, I'm very vocal about what I believe. Like I have things in my office that are vocal about what I believe. I sign my emails in ways that are vocal about what I believe. And that's what I can control at this point, is how I care for my patients and tend with my staff. So I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I'm just not sure.
I'm curious. I know that earlier you said that you identify as an ally. Mm-hmm. How do you see that identity as an ally and as a chaplain at Ball Memorial together?
So yeah, I have specifically made sure to be a voice in the midst of that. Again, like I've made sure my department knows that I am a safe person. So I hope that if they feel like they can't be a brave or safe person, that they'll call me to be that brave or safe person. Because again, I can't necessarily control their own religious beliefs. I have learned this. I can live a life that supports why I believe what I believe and why it makes sense and why it works. I see myself with staff and physicians being a little bit more of an advocate because truly, like, I am the spiritual person that they're coming into contact with. And so if I'm the educated spiritual person they're coming into contact for them to know that, like, yeah, I am somebody who will ask about someone's pronouns, or I am someone who cares about someone's chosen name, or I am someone who will be completely comfortable going into a room where someone has chosen a label that maybe they're confused by, right? And so I'm a bit more of an advocate, and I speak up in those situations to say, I'm comfortable in this moment, like, here's what I could offer that would be helpful for the whole team. And that's a way in which I see myself, like, being a good ally in the work that I do, is whenever I'm the professional on the team, that I use the knowledge that I know to make sure that this patient is cared for with the utmost love. And I feel like I have not encountered people who have said to me, like, who have talked back to that anyway. I will say it is hard to speak up at times when you're in a room that has a lot of people with MD behind their name, or like right titles that, like, I recognize I don't have, but I recognize I have a different title, right? And it gives me the courage to speak up and recognize that, like, I have had this privileged education, and while they were studying science, they were not taking queer theory and theology. They were not taking these classes that I was taking. And so I do see myself as an advocate for patients in that way. And that, I would say, that's a way that I live out being an ally in the hospital. Yeah.
I'm curious, how are you an ally in the broader Muncie community?
That's a good question. And I feel like something I'm still trying to figure out in some ways in being here, because I attend a church that is technically open and affirming. Again, like, I don't know if I see that, like, preached or lived out on a daily, you know what I mean? I mean, there's people who are there. Our denomination is open and affirming. It's not a huge piece of my denomination. It's not like, not my denomination, my church here in Muncie. I have attended lots of Presbyterian churches where that's been a huge part of our advocacy in the community, right? Like, we have a huge celebration at Pride Week and communion for everyone, and, like, right, like, it's so, like, that has been, like, a huge part of my culture outside of Muncie. That isn't a piece here at the church I attend. And so I've been specifically focused on seeking out ways. At this point, I have a 2.5-year-old daughter, to make sure that she is exposed to people and learning to love them. So I have sought out childcare where her teachers openly identify as gay or lesbian. They make sure to read books in class that have families that look all different ways. And so my child, that is being normalized for her at an early age, which is really important to me at this point. I feel like if I can raise someone, who also is in this, I don't know if I want to use the word fight, but sometimes it feels like that. this fight for equality, I think for her, I want that for her. I don't know, right? She may be a lesbian. I don't know. She may grow up and tell me she's a boy. I don't know. And so for me, I want her to know that she can come to me with that, and I will say, wonderful, like, you're beloved, that's all I want, is for her to know that would be my response. And so right now, that's been my main focus, is trying to get connected with a community that is also their concern. And I'll be honest, it's been hard to find here. I know that most of that community I have found either attends again, my whole life is in spirituality, so either attends the Unitarian Universalist Church, which isn't my brand of religion, right? And so part of me has been like, do I go there? Because maybe those are people that I I feel similar with in a lot of viewpoints, but also I am a Christian, as is my spouse, and so that doesn't feel like it's the right worshiping community for us. And then other people we found are also at the Lutheran Church of the Cross, which is very open and affirming, and we're good friends with the pastor there and some of the people there we've had relationships with. And so it's trying to build that community to really know what is needed here. Even in thinking about this project, I have friends who identify as gay or lesbian in this town, and they're skeptical, right? They're skeptical of wanting to be interviewed for something. What does that? Why? Why in Muncie? What is there to gain from that? And I get that, right? I get it in Muncie. And so it's kind of hard to know what is even at this point a place that everyone can move from, right? There needs to be. And so I'm still trying to figure that out, to be honest. I'm here a year, and I want to figure that out because it's been such an important part of my life for the past 10 to 15 years. And I don't know where it is necessarily in Muncie, and so I'm working on that. It's a work in progress.
Yes. What resources do you see as necessary in Muncie to grow and welcome the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I think that definitely there need to be more churches that just very clearly proclaim not that all are welcome, but literally that LGBTQ people are welcome. I think we can all say all are welcome, but have we really done the education required to welcome these people? And for me, I could say in churches I've served, I told them we would not put that on our sign until we had done studies on racism and we had done studies on our own homophobia as a congregation, because truly these people aren't welcome. And I'm not going to say they're welcome if you're not going to welcome them, right? And so I think that education is a piece of it in our churches, which is still where a lot of people gather in this community. That's a place people are still willing to be educated, right? Lots of people don't continue past high school or college in this town, but they're still willing to be educated in their churches. So our churches should be doing this. That's really important to me. And I think churches are still they always call themselves a purple church, red and blue mixed together, right? And so they're unwilling to kind of rock the boat, which I get, but our congregations are already not growing anyways. So let's just be open, right? I mean, I don't know. So to me, I think that's really honestly one of the main places. There's only a few churches that truly are we are open and accepting of the LGBTQ community. We will put it on our sign. We will make it known on our website, right? So I think that's one piece that's needed. One piece that I've seen already happening is education for kids around sex and sexuality in a more open way. I think so much of the education in this area has been based on purity culture. That was the education I received as a child. It will not be how I'm teaching my child about sex and sexuality. And so I've seen that happening. I get through the Unitarian Universalist Church. I've seen that happening. And so we'll most likely reach out when my daughter is that age to make sure that there's someone else offering that perspective to her, because it's so hard to have those conversations as parents. You just don't want to hear what your parents have to say about sex or sexuality. So obviously I'll be constantly teaching her that and wanting to be open to that, but I don't know that. So I'm glad to see that that's happening, but I think there needs to be more of that in our schools. I think there's still very much an abstinence-only education, and the education is focused on a heterosexual relationship. So what does that look like? To need, like, you still need to use protection if you're in a gay or lesbian relationship, right? You can still get STDs. Like, you may not get pregnant, but that is not the right, like STDs are spreading. And so, like, how are we as schools, how are we like recognizing kids are having like sex, right? And not just with people of the opposite gender. So and I don't see that being taught in our schools. And so we're ill-equipping our children to protect themselves, to stay healthy, to stay safe, and to learn about what truly a healthy relationship looks like. It doesn't look like just being in a heterosexual relationship because that's what it's expected. It looks like being in a healthy relationship you're excited about, where both people are consenting and treat each other with respect. So, right, like, I don't think that's really being taught. I know, that has not been the sex ed education. My mom was a school nurse. That was not the sex ed education that was, being presented down the pipeline. So I think those are really key places, because in raising, I have learned from being a church person, it's really hard to change the oldest generation's mind. They're set, they're done. Honestly, scientifically, they're not super capable of learning new things. Okay, so I can just let that be. But what we can still change is the people who are still learning and engaging and willing to learn, which is the middle-aged people in our churches and our kids and our youth. So I think that's really what this community needs. Yeah.
Yes. I know that you mentioned a sex education course. Would you mind talking a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, literally, like, in my mom's group popped up because I'm in some of these moms groups that want to help, right, our kids think a little bit more open-minded. And so a class that is teaching early kind of sexuality education to young kids. So this one I think is like second graders, like young kids. But really that's when we should start these conversations. And so it's a class that mainly I think these moms have put together, but one is seminary educated. Reverend Elizabeth Carrington Ladd, I believe, is the kind of head of it. But other moms that I know from the group are part of it as well. So I saw them like offering this in my mom's group. So I kind of like clicked on it to like see like, okay, like what would this be about? What would, and as I clicked on it even, and I think this is fair, it had questions to even get into the group to see like, so you can't just come troll in their group about it, right? And I was like, that's fair, right? Because like, if you're going to come in here and just say like, we should just be teaching something, like that's not what we're doing. And so I was happy to see like that was an option, and even in that I was able to see like, yeah, like it's still like that's not going to be probably the chosen class for most of Muncie. And so what does that look like, right? That we have to keep offering these things and teaching our kids and showing that this different way could be a good way, could be good. But we're hesitant about change as a community here in Muncie especially. And so, yeah.
Yes. I know you mentioned that there are some more conservative leaning minds in the First Presbyterian Church that you attend. Mm-hmm. Do you see that continuing in the leadership of First Presbyterian?
Not in like the ordained staff. I would say not in the ordained staff. In the way my churches run, there's a board of elders who are elected. It's much like the United States government, which sometimes functions and sometimes doesn't in the church as well as our own society. So you elect these people to kind of represent the rest of the congregation. The congregation elects them. So the leadership is changing all the time. And so I think that's good and bad, because you can get a mix of people who maybe are all like-minded one year, and then the session kind of rolls over and changes. And it's very much like it's in tiers. So there's 3 different classes. So you have kind of wisdom from the people who started out and been on it, and then the new people coming in. Right now, I would say that they're very open. I was very clear, like they didn't have a children's ministry right now. And I have experience in doing that. I have a child that I'm invested in wanting to, and so my spouse also has education in that. And so we offered that we would begin something for the youngest kids. But we were very clear that we weren't willing to offer our gifts unless everything we taught was able to be open and affirming. And they knew that if any of the kids in the church came to us and came out, like we would be a brave, safe place, and we would encourage them to continue to pursue those questions with God, and that God loved them. And we made sure that ran through the session, that they knew we were like, we're not willing to offer our gifts if this isn't a given. And that they were all fine with it. So, but we kind of just put that out there as like, we need to start bravely saying, like, this is what we expect for our kid here. Like, this is what we expect the education to be in this church. So we're going to put in writing and pass it through that this is what will be happening. And if you all want to like fight about it, that's fine, but we're not going to offer our gifts here. Then this isn't going to be where we offer our gifts. And so, yeah, right now I feel like that there was no pushback on that at all. But I also think it has taken just kind of bravely speaking into the space. This is going to be my expectation. This is what I will teach. I will not be teaching, right, that everyone in here is going to marry into some sort of heterosexual relationship and have children. Like, I don't know. Every one of these children is unique. So that was made clear, and the leadership was completely fine with that. So, but again, that could change, right? Like 3 years from now, new people elected, it's always kind of like ebbing and flowing. And there are people in the church, I think I would say, especially probably the oldest generation, who that is still, they didn't understand when our denomination made a vote to be fully open and affirming to allow openly LGBTQ clergy to serve. They didn't understand. They didn't understand when we then allowed full gay marriage in the church, like, and yet it all passed in our church. So it's, yeah, I think it's still a learning process. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious because I know you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that you've come back to Muncie.
Mm-hmm.
What is the reason that you came back to Muncie?
So we mainly came back to be near family again for my daughter. My spouse and I never thought we would do that. My spouse isn't from here. He's from Virginia. But we really realized we wanted help with my daughter. And so we wanted her to have that relationship, and honestly, childcare is ridiculously expensive. So it's nice having some free childcare. But truly, we both like this community. My husband has a job that he likes here now. I don't know, we feel invested in it, and so finding a way to like continue to live like who we are here feels important, and it feels scary. Like, I want my child to be in a more diverse school system than I grew up in. I want her to not feel the pressure to be one specific sexuality or one specific way. And I don't know how to help her in this community. I knew how to do that better when I was living in Chicago, I'll be honest, or even when I was living in Kalamazoo, which was just a little bit more open-minded community in Michigan. And so that's something my spouse and I need to navigate, and we have at the very top of our list, right? Like, as we start to figure out, like, where will she go to school? How will we provide these people in her life that make this normal? I don't want her to feel like she can't be who she is, and I want her to be able to support her friends as they are. So yeah, we moved back here, and we moved back here for family, and that has been a good choice. We do truly care about this community. I think we could do good work in this community, and it feels a little bit like we haven't had to like get that stuff kind of started or figure out how to get into it. When we lived in Chicago, it was there, and we were able to quickly begin that like advocacy work. And so we've done a lot of advocacy work that feels not relevant here in Muncie, and so we need to refigure out like what does that look like here. Yeah.
Yes. I'm curious because I know that your goal of working with advocacy, do you see the LGBTQ community here in Muncie as visible today?
Truly, I don't. And again, that could be my own like 100% like blinders. And I think this community is sectioned off in weird ways and always has been. There's like the South Side, that's like anyone who's not white. There's just honest, right? There's like the Ball State community where all the educated people just like kind of hunker down together. There's like the rural community and so like again, maybe there's like this very specific portion of the community that's hanging out together, but I don't see this community as being a community that has been good at intersecting in any way. I don't see that in our church hours and Sunday morning. I don't see that in clubs, sports, participation. Everything is very kind of sectioned off by color, by education, by income. And so I think that then plays into the LGBTQ community as well. Like if we're so sectioned off, we're not encountering one another in meaningful ways. Yeah, and that hasn't been my experience in other communities I've been in. So again, that could be completely my own blinders and privilege. I'm aware of that. And I have not seen them as being very specifically visible in this town in a way that anyone has chosen to really like lift up in government, in church. Yeah. And I would love to see that, because I think in other communities I've been in, that has added a lot of love and intersectionality to the community in a way that has brought growth.
Yes. And going along with that, I know in May 2015 or March 2015, the Amendment 14F passed that allowed for gay marriage in the Presbyterian Church. How have you seen that impacting the First Presbyterian community here?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So for me, that was like a huge pivotal moment in my life. I can remember where I was when the vote passed. I remember I was waiting. A certain number of presbyteries had to vote on it for it to tip, for there to be enough votes that it would go. And I can clearly remember where I was in that moment. I was watching and waiting. I knew how many presbyteries were voting that day, and when the presbytery went through that voted for it, I can remember. So it was a huge, important moment for me in my life, and like the work that I had done, and feeling like I was ordained when the gay marriage finally went through. I was not ordained yet when they were making the decision about whether LGBTQ people could be ordained and out in our church. And so for me, like that whole process was kind of in the midst of my ordination in my first years of ordination. And was really pivotal in me deciding, like, can I be a part of this? Do I feel like I can, with integrity, be a part of this? And I would say at First Presbyterian Church, it's been interesting because in that amount of time, we went from having the Reverend Ron Naylor, who retired after 29 years, and the church was in the midst of a lot of transition, and hired a head of staff that I think, because we have not been open about these questions, they did not ask this head of staff what he thought about these issues, which is a huge blind spot, because this was a huge topic of conversation in our denomination, right? And he did not agree with the gay marriage amendment, and he did not agree with LGBTQ people being ordained. Well, at the same time, they were hiring an associate pastor who was openly lesbian. And it created a lot of tension in the church, and really completely unhealthy. I mean, I don't know I wasn't here for the whole situation, but completely unhealthy for this person who was openly lesbian and serving as God called her to serve, right? And so this male had no authority, right, anything to think differently on that than support her, because this is who the church called as their pastors. But that kind of brought the conversation to the forefront in the way that the church, I think, was not comfortable with. And then in the midst of that healing, because there was a huge, as this head of staff was asked to leave, an issue that I think got brushed under the rug in the hope of bringing healing quicker, because there were other issues with this pastor. And so feels like it's at a place now in my church that it had come to like a forefront, and the time was ripe, right, to like just have this conversation. Like, let's as a church just do like a year-long like study on this so that we're all informed and we know like, what does scripture actually say? Our church believes in reading the scripture with your education right by you, right? Like having kind of both side by side. So this isn't an issue that should be difficult in our denomination, and yet it is, because there are still very strong held beliefs in this community that there is a right way to be Christian in your sexuality. And so now I'm not quite sure where that leaves the First Presbyterian Church of Muncie in the midst of that amendment. I know 100%, right? Like, I mean, I've offered, as has my spouse, like, to one of my child's daycare teachers who's has a very serious boyfriend, that I would marry them. If they wanted to get married at my church, which they don't, but if they wanted to get married at my church, the session has say over anyone who gets married at the church. Would they say yes? I can't 100% say that they would, and that's scary to me. But I don't know, because my church hasn't just had these conversations openly. I can say for myself that it doesn't matter to me, and I don't, like, they don't have any say over who I marry or what I do because I'm ordained. But they still have say over their physical space, and I wonder about that. And honestly, it's a question I need answered sooner rather than later to decide whether I can continue to raise my child in this church. And so I'm not sure. We just got a new pastor, and I've kind of been waiting to see like if those conversations are going to happen, and to just have that conversation openly with the leadership, because I don't feel like I can continue to support a church or a denomination who would say someone couldn't be married in their space. But that's hard when it's like a church that you've also like fought in to like, right, really want to be loving, and has nurtured me in ways that help me grow, as I shared, right? Like it kept like this open space for me in the midst of what wasn't open in Muncie. So yeah, I think that's still kind of like to be decided. Yeah.
I'm excited you're here to advocate. I think those were the majority of my questions. I really appreciate your time. As we close the interview, I'm curious, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Other than, I think, just in my own spirituality, I'm always a person of hope. So I'm just going to add that I'm hopeful for this community. I'm going to be in it for a bit here now, and so I'm hopeful for my child and hopeful for her friends that we can create a loving space for them to be who they are called to be. So I guess that's the only thing I'd maybe want at the end, is that I do have hope in the midst of it, and I'll keep living into that hope and working for justice. So yeah.
Yes. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to cover?
I don't think so.
I really appreciate your time and help with this interview. It was wonderful speaking to you today. So we'll conclude this interview for the Muncie LGBTQ Project. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emma.